Hello and welcome to Back to the 80s, the podcast that travels back through time in a rose-tinted DeLorean. It's been a little while since I've said those words on a podcast. Roughly about 4 years, 3 to 4 years. Hello, my name's Glenn. I live in Swansea in South Wales and I am a massive nerd and the 80s are my favourite decade. I used to do a podcast called, funnily enough, Back to the 80s. For just over 10 years it was. Started roughly about 2010. And in that time, did lots of episodes, covered a lot of subjects, and then stopped doing it. Just stopped the podcast, didn't do it anymore. With little to no fanfare. I don't think there was any fanfare, if I'm being perfectly honest. But I stopped doing it. And recently I went to a Transformers convention in Birmingham and I saw a lot of people there that I haven't seen for a very long time. And some of them said, I miss you doing podcasting. Why aren't you doing podcasting anymore? And it got me thinking, why aren't I doing podcasting anymore? I should be doing it. So this is my little attempt, my first foray back into podcasting. There's a lot of work still to do. There's software I still need to get and there's hosting I still need to get. But I thought I need to test my brand new microphone out. And I need to stop that guy outside from revving his car. And I also need to sort of get back into the swing of things just a little bit and sort of explain what's going on, what you can expect from me, just to see if people like it. The 80s are my favourite decade. I would say the 80s and then probably the 90s, because it's that old man thing of, I wish things were like they were. Because they were carefree, and there's a reason they were carefree. I was young. The weight of the world had not yet ground me down, and I didn't have responsibilities, so of course. But also, there were some awesome things going on. You had a lot of good media back then. Cartoons were fantastic, and they're just as good now. Believe me, this isn't a case of an old man going, things were better in my day, everything now is shit. It isn't. It's just that they're not made for me anymore. But there were a lot of good things going on. There were a lot of good media. There were good toys. Tech was sort of taking off. There were a lot of exciting things happening in video gaming. There were some great films that came out. The music was brilliant. It was that classic that they're still being played to these days. And you have 80s nights and 90s nights. And the other thing about those two decades, it's called Back to the 80s. We will be talking about the 90s as well. But the good thing about those two decades is they were so fundamentally different at their heart. The 90s were nothing like the 80s. Whereas now things seem to be a bit... I don't know, is this because I'm old? But things seem to be a bit generic these days. One decade sort of just blurs into the other one. Whereas there were delineation points. There were times when they felt so different. And I would like to talk about that, basically, week by week. Maybe pick a year, pick a subject, pick a song. Last night I went through some old adverts from 1986. And that was fun. I think I miss the podcasting element of things. And I miss talking to you guys and trying to get across just how much I love this decade. So what can you expect? Basically, what you'll find on here is retro gaming. So we'll be going into arcade deep dives. We'll be doing classic console playthroughs. I do have emulators on my computer. I would admit it might be Sega heavy because I am very much a Sega boy. I grew up with, first off, I grew up with the Sinclair Spectrum, 1 to 8K plus 2, which, as all of you know, he says, knowing that most people don't because they're not nerds, that was the one that was the Alan Sugar version of the Sinclair Spectrum. When he had bought it off Sir Clive and went, yeah, we can make lads of money off this, lads. And, just cheaped it out, stuck a cassette sort of in it rather than having it separate. And I didn't care. It was a great machine. I loved it. So I started off on that, graduated to things like the Master System, the Mega Drive. Nintendo wasn't so much a fixture in my childhood. And I'm sure in a future episode I'll explain exactly why. But yeah, so that'll happen. Pop culture and movies, because yeah. So there'll be lots of trivia. There'll be breakdown of greatest 80s cinema. There'll be 80s TV shows. So much spotlight on things like Transformers, G.I. Joe, He-Man, all of that good stuff. Music, I'll be exploring the iconic tracks that are still played to this day. As I said, a lot of them are classics now. And some stuff that you might not think is a classic, or some stuff you might not have heard of, because we all know the tracks that get played all the time, the Rick Astleys, the Kylies, the pop that was great, the hair metal, brilliant, all good stuff. But there were some songs from the 80s that maybe you haven't heard or didn't know existed. And I will try and spotlight those as much as possible. Vintage tech and toys, as I said, there were so many sort of gadgets and failed things like Betamax, the Sinclair C5, which I am obsessed with, I have to say. Really big fan of the Sinclair C5 and the absolute failure of that thing. And also some of the computers of the day. Lots of interesting stuff. And obviously the toys, you've got your Transformers, your He-Mans, but also some of the failed toys of that era as well, because it was very much an era where things were thrown at the wall, but the market was absolutely saturated. So one of the things I really love were Visionaries. I thought they were the greatest toys ever. They were action figures in the 3 3/4 inch range that Hasbro did so well with things like G.I. Joe. And they also came with holographic stickers on them, because it was the 80s and holographic stickers were awesome. Apparently they were the future. And the conceit is that these toys, or the characters portrayed by the toys, they all had magic, because science had failed on their world, and magic rose, and these stickers on their chest represented their animal totems. It was all very D&D Lord of the Rings, which wasn't surprising, because one of the creators, or the creative forces behind this, was a guy called Flint Dille. And Flint Dille was very much involved with D&D. He wrote, and I think starred in very briefly, the video cassette that you got with the game Dragon Strike, which Dragon Strike was a D&D, sort of baby's first D&D. So he was involved in that. He was also involved in Visionaries, and there's a very D&D feel to it. I know this now. I sort of suspected it at the time, but I know it now because I play D&D. That's one of the things that has changed since I did this podcast. I am now one of those people who collects dice and go click-clack with the Mathrocks. Yeah, that's me. So I would also like to go into things like Moral Panics, just offshooting on that, because I think some of that is fascinating. I really, really do want to do a commentary on Mazes and Monsters, because as we all know, Mazes and Monsters is a far-out game. So it's all that stuff. I just want to explore the 80s, and also, like I say, some of the 90s, because the 90s was very interesting as well. You had the rise of the Ladette. You had Oasis versus Blur. You had all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. Like a whole episode about the Word. And if you've never heard of the Word, it is not bird. Let's put it that way. Bird is not the word that I'm talking about. Or things like the rise of the lad mags and lots of interesting stuff. But there's even sort of the ephemeral nostalgia. Sort of like what cars were around, what sort of TV programs were on, adverts. It's all really interesting stuff, and it's all... I find the ephemera sometimes more interesting than the main bullet points, because things like adverts and public information films, especially that kind of thing, they are pure and simple social commentary. They tell us exactly where we were at a certain time. And there's also news stories, you know. There were a lot of things that happened in the 80s and the 90s. Not all good, you know. It's one of those things that people nostalgize about how great things were back in the day. And then you look at the news. That we live in a sort of the generation where people kept things on videotapes. And the 80s was really the first decade that started happening. There was some in the 70s, but video cassette recorders were really expensive. And they were really expensive in the 80s as well. But more people had them. And people would tape a program, and the news would get left in as well. The adverts would get left in, and people are now starting to upload that stuff onto YouTube. And I find it really fascinating to go back and watch old news reports and news programs just to see where we were and how we thought. And sometimes things haven't really changed at all. We have exactly the same worries, concerns, sometimes the same news stories, depressingly. Some situations still haven't been sorted out. But sometimes it's stuff that you wouldn't even think of these days. So that's interesting as well. You have the rise and fall of certain TV stations over here. Not so much in America. In the States, things pretty much stay the same. But over here, you've got the rise and fall of networks, television programs, ideas, concepts that you wouldn't even think of now. Some of it cancelable, let's face it. A lot of the TV personalities that were around back then, you don't talk about in the same tones. They are very much hush tones after, shall we say 2010, 2011. But were very commonplace back then, and that always makes watching old television programs. And all of a sudden it's, and here we have a special guest, it's Jimmy, and then we'll leave it there. So, yeah, things have changed. It's been 40 years. It's been over 40 years since the 80s. 46 years since that decade started. So things change. People change. Comedy changes. But I think it's all worth talking about. And eulogising without nostalgising. Or is it nostalgising without eulogising? I think it's probably that way round. So this is sort of, shall we say, session 0, where I'm just setting up my stall and saying what's going on, giving you a taste of the sort of things that I'll be wanting to talk about, wanting to discuss. Feel free to ask questions. Feel free to suggest episodes. Feel free to suggest things that you'd like me to talk about. As long as that thing isn't fuck off. Fuck off and die. Do not talk about this stuff. We're not interested. If you're not interested, feel free to scroll by. Feel free to not listen. I wouldn't want to force anybody. But if you are interested, if you do want to listen, if you do want to have a natter about the 80s, please, more than interested to do that. Can't wait to start in anger in the next couple of weeks. My name is Glenn. I am an 80s-aholic. This has been Back to the 80s, Session 0. Take care of yourselves and each other. Bye-bye for now.